have a quick pitch from Mr. Edmund Ed Beaton. And then we'll begin.
Two quick announcements. Number one, the breeze up here is much better than the breeze back there. So if that should move you to come up, that would be good. On this Saturday from 10 to 12, there's going to be a Phragmites cutting to try to keep the herring run open. That happens at the bottom of the 40 steps. We'd love to have people come along, wear long pants, sleeves, boots, water boots, cutting tools, gloves, all that sort of thing. See Pam Danforth if you can be a part of it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, And I also want to thank Sean Leahy, who's recording this for all those who are at the Red Sox altar in their TV sets tonight. You can watch this later on the website. Welcome. Tonight is the second of our 3 heritage presentations. This evening we will learn much about our founders in Craigville and what they might teach us. Craigville was formed after the Civil War, before the World War I, the first pandemic, and at the beginning of a technological age. The founders arrived here during a time of religious and political ferment. They changed the land, incorporating modernity and structure and dress and social interaction inside a living and fiercely independent faith. That mattered as a guidepost in the midst of modernity. We have 2 guides to that time with us tonight. Welcome, Beth Nordbeck. Dr. Elizabeth Nordbeck is the former Moses Brown Professor of Ecclesiastical History and former Dean at Andover Newton Theological School. She is also a former Dean of Lancaster Theological Seminary and the former President of the New Hampshire Conference of the United Church of Christ. She is also an author and editor of a number of publications, including the 4th volume of the Living Theological Heritage of the United Church of Christ and an authority on church history, including specifically that of our Craigville forebears. She wrote The Origins of the Christian Denomination in New England, pertinent to our Craigville heritage. I have some personal resonance in greeting her, not only for her scholarship and historical and theological endeavors, but because she shared the trail with my father, Gabe Thacker, coming also from Lancaster Theological Seminary to Andover Newton. My mom also shared in that journey as a colleague, and I know they would both be grateful and happy to hear Dr. Nordbeck speak in this tabernacle about what built this community in this place. We also welcome Dr. Bill McCain, our CCMA president and burgeoning Craigville historian in his own right, former president and professor of American religion at the Pacific School of Religion in Berkeley, former dean of Hartford Seminary, a sociologist of religion by training, and an ordained minister in the United Church of Christ. His research interests include Protestant congregational dynamics, that's quite a topic, Bill, and mainline Protestant history and prospects. We'll begin tonight with Beth Nordbeck. Thank you for welcoming her.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me here. It's really great to be here. Quite a few years since I have been, just as beautiful as the last time I was here. Let me say a couple of things to begin. First of all, the Christians, or the Christian Connection, as they called themselves early on, were a complicated, fascinating, and in many ways obscure movement of the 19th century. Any of you who are part of today's United Church of Christ might recall that this is the smallest of the 4 groups that make up our contemporary denomination. But then again, you might not. That's how obscure they are. The Christian Connection, which by the way spelt its name with an X typically, is also a movement that was remarkably progressive, prophetic, and in some ways thoroughly modern, long, long before its time. And for that reason alone, it's worth learning about. Sadly, we don't have time, I wish we did, but we don't, to explore in detail much of this group's fascinating history. But what I hope to do for a few minutes this evening is give you a sense, even if an abbreviated one, of how these people came to be, what they believed in, and why today we should even care. So let's begin with a Jeopardy-type question. Here it is. People in the years 1793 and 2022 have this experience in common. The answer? What is societal change? What is rapid societal change? This phenomenon, rapid societal change, is key to understanding both the origins of the group that called itself the Christian Connection and the beliefs that these people held. Periods of rapid societal change typically involve not one, but many challenges to the way things have always been. Where do these changes take place? Everywhere, which is why they're so problematic for so many people. Governance, economics, demographics, racial and gender roles, scientific and technological innovations, immigration, communication, transportation, and even, we'll have to add this today, climate. These are a few of the arenas in which massive shifts periodically occur. Although the specific sources of change may differ, what is almost always true of this phenomenon is that it's accompanied by widespread dis-ease, disruption, and sometimes even by violence. We've certainly seen this in 2022 and over the past few years. But rapid changes can also be accompanied by the emergence of exciting new ideas and institutions, noteworthy innovations that seek to redefine the status quo in ways that are both idealistic and positive. So this was the situation in 1793. In 1793, the United States was just 17 years old, and only 2 years into an essentially complete but still experimental governing structure that had originated with a couple of truly radical assertions: that all men are created equal, and that governance is derived from the consent of the governed. In 1793, the Industrial Revolution was just beginning in America. Migration westward into the hinterlands of the eastern states and into the Northwest Territories was beginning to resume after years of war, and some older towns were experiencing depopulation. Many families now sought personal independence by moving to rural areas where land was abundant and established structures were few. It was an era of widespread and expansive populism. This is a word that we've also heard in the past few years of our own time. Populism refers to movements among ordinary people, typically movements that are resolutely anti-authoritarian. Populists tend to be critical of top-down leadership and leaders, and they are often mistrustful of those leaders' motives, actions, and supporting structures. Among those who were critical of existing leaders and structures at the end of the 18th and the beginning of the 19th century were members of 4 different Protestant groups. And herein lies one of the complicating facts about the Christian Connection. The Connection is an example of what scholars sometimes call the multiple origins of similar phenomena. In the decade between 1793 and 1803, Abner Jones and Elias Smith, both of whom were New Englanders of Baptist and Congregational heritage, a Methodist, James O'Kelly from Virginia, and a Presbyterian, Barton W. Stone, in Kentucky, all abandoned their former faiths and faith groups to start something new and different in their respective regions. The reasons for doing so were not entirely similar. Smith and Jones met and joined together in espousing anti-creedal and anti-Calvinist views. O'Kelly argued against the excessive power of Methodist bishops. And Stone believed that both the Presbyterian system of governance and its rigid doctrinal theology were flawed. But more important, they all shared certain commitments that were typical of this populist age. They supported democratic structures, even in churches. They believed in the right to worship without, as they said, pernicious and soul-binding constraints, which is to say, without doctrines imposed by so-called authorities and in which everybody was expected to believe. They supported lay leadership and the empowerment of everyday people to manage their own faith lives. And they promoted an emotion-filled and experiential religion, what today we would call revivalism. But most remarkable of all was that each of these men decided independently that the appropriate name for their new groups was the nonpartisan and unifying name shared by every follower of Jesus, simply Christian. The story of how three turn-of-the-century movements, hundreds of miles apart, came together is complicated. And as I've said, unfortunately, we have too little time to explore it in much detail. But we should note three things that contributed to the eventual coalescence of what became the Christian movement and eventually the Christian denomination. The first thing was itinerancy. Itinerancy refers to evangelists traveling about to preach and teach rather than settling in one place and serving a single congregation. In those days, of course, itinerancy was on foot or on horseback. Certainly a really tough life for even the most zealous and committed preacher. As they visited various communities up and down the East Coast, itinerant evangelists promoted their beliefs, and in many places, especially rural ones, they gathered churches. Itinerants met and talked together and shared their common experiences all over the East Coast and eventually a bit further west. So over time, common ideas and practices in this populist movement were articulated and lived out in many, often very, very tiny, new congregations. A second contributor to unity was periodic local conferences and meetings. In these occasional events, Christian evangelists and others met for mutual support and information sharing. It didn't take long for traveling preachers to realize that good order and group solidarity, not to mention effective evangelism, depended on common commitments and procedures. As we'll hear from Bill a little bit later on, later in the century, places like Craigville and other camp meeting sites did the same thing for an older body of Christians. A third contributor, and perhaps the most important and influential one, was a publication called the Herald of Gospel Liberty, founded by Elias Smith out of Portsmouth, New Hampshire in 1808. This was, in fact, the very first religious periodical in America, which is in itself a significant historical milestone. And the Herald was, without any exaggeration, the internet of its day for evangelists of the Christian movement. Its pages served for 10 years as a bully pulpit for the notoriously cantankerous Elias Smith, who eventually left the Christian fold to become a Universalist. But the Herald also provided a forum for dozens of men and a few women to share their experiences by way of letters from the field, and to refine and rehearse the distinctive principles of their developing faith. So what were these distinctive principles? Eventually, the movement developed 6 of these. Early on, however, Elias Smith listed just 3 foundational principles for the emerging movement. These were, first of all, no confession of faith but the Christian scriptures. Smith and his colleagues believed that creeds, confessions, and doctrinal statements of all sorts were the primary source of religious sectarianism and divisiveness. They insisted that the Bible itself, not formulations of elite and authoritarian interpreters, should be sufficient for right-minded and faithful believers. A second principle was no head over the church but Christ. Any of you who are UCC members will be familiar with this because it's shared today. For the earliest of these Christians, popes, bishops, priests, presbyteries, even local ordained ministers were unnecessary. It was only Christ to whom the faithful need look for guidance. And this was important and very radical indeed. To assert that Christ is the only head of the church was in fact to equalize all believers. All church members, including women, were subject not to any human authority, but to divine authority alone. Finally, like his counterparts, whom he did not even know in Virginia and Kentucky, Smith insisted on no name but Christian. Christian was the name divinely given to Christ's first followers, and it was also the one that seemed to involve no sectarian designations nor provoke any arguments or divisions. All other names like Presbyterian or Episcopalian or Congregational or Baptist, all other names evoked party particularities instead of the allegiance to Christ that is held by all the faithful. For almost a century, members of this new Christian movement deviated very little from Elias Smith's fundamental principles. But by about 1830, 2 additional principles had been clearly articulated and widely accepted. Both of them were implicit, if unstated, in earlier commitments. Another was included a decade or 2 later. The right of private judgment is an obvious corollary to the conviction that the scriptures are sufficient for faith and practice. If there are no elite theologians interpreting for the masses, then it's up to the masses to do their own interpreting. Somewhat ironically, no other commitment caused the Christians more trouble than this fundamentally unifying one. Because of it, Unitarians and Trinitarians, revivalists and opponents of revival, people who believed in baptism by immersion and baptism by sprinkling, and people who believed fundamentally in no baptism at all of these could find a welcome spiritual home within the fellowship. Christian insiders, of course, understood it was clearly about unity and acceptance. Outsiders, though, saw this crazy mix as nothing but theological chaos and confusion, if not outright heresy. A 5th principle, also implicit if unstated in the early years, was Christian character as the test for Christian fellowship. If church fellowship or membership didn't depend on assent to theological propositions or on confessions and creeds, then how could it be adjudicated? Christians argued that fellowship was dependent on morally upright behavior, the one criterion in which all denominations seem to find agreement, regardless of their different theological beliefs. And finally, number 6. Christian thinking from the earliest days included the principle of unity, most obviously embodied in the idea of the Christian name only. By mid-century, however, a belief in the essential or ontological unity of all Christians had achieved its own distinct status as a basic principle. Although Christians did eventually engage in talks regarding organic unity, or merger as we'd say today, this principle was always more a statement of spiritual value, an attitude of charity and acceptance toward other bodies that encouraged and enabled fellowship despite theological differences. So, what eventually happened to the Christian connection? In the beginning, these passionate believers had hoped to unify Christendom, at least in America, through a return to something like the pristine simplicity of the early church. They saw their movement as just that, a movement, not a structure or an institution, and certainly not a denomination. For this reason, they initially rejected ministers and formal education and ordination, and often even the keeping of church records. As an historian, I'm very sorry about this, because much of the wonderful history of this body of people is lost since it was never recorded. But reality eventually intervened. As early as 1820, the Christians were already experiencing various challenges and disruptions. There were, then as now, scandalous preachers and evangelists who caused local disruptions by preaching faulty doctrine. There was criticism or misunderstanding from other religious groups and the need for common inculcation of Christian beliefs. Then in the 1830s, in the early 1830s, some Christians who had been followers of Barton W. Stone in Kentucky exited and informally joined with followers of Joseph and Thomas Campbell, eventually becoming what is today the Christian Church, Disciples of Christ. All these problems made it clear that more structure and formal discipline were needed. Eventually, writers like David Millard and Nicholas Somerville, I noticed that Nicholas Somerville has a street here named after him, and Austin Craig, began to describe standard Christian beliefs and practices in worship, ordination, discipline, and other matters of church order. And so, within little more than a half-century after its rough and rural beginnings, the Christian connection began to look less and less like a movement and more like one of the very institutions it had arisen to critique. Attempts to unify the disparate parts of this body, unfortunately, coalesced in 1850 with a general convention from 11 eastern states and Canada in Marion, Ohio, bringing to an end the Christian dream of remaining a movement. Unity between northern and southern Christians was thwarted by the divisive issue of slavery, for nearly all Christian leadership in the South consisted of active slaveholders. In the aftermath of the Civil War, however, the movement for unity reemerged, even as newly freed slaves now founded their own congregations on Christian principles. Freed slaves finding those themes of independence and everyday mastery of one's own faith to be very congenial to their situation. Today, the former Afro-Christian Conference hosts the largest regional number of black churches in the United Church of Christ. In 1890, just a little bit less than 100 years after their movement began, Northern and Southern Christians agreed to a simple plan of comity that healed their divisions and created for the first time a unified national body. 40 years later, in 1931, A majority of Christian churches joined with their far, far more numerous congregational counterparts to become a brand new body, the Congregational Christian Churches. But note the new name. Not the Congregational Christian Church, but the Congregational Christian Churches. Even in this union, one that effectively eliminated a discrete Christian denomination, Christians retained their historic independence. No overarching hierarchy would mar the fundamental autonomy of local Christian churches. Today, in 2022, there are still a few Christian churches that are not part of the United Church of Christ. Some of these are now affiliated with loose fellowships, such as the Conservative Congregational Christian Conference or the National Association of Congregational Christian Churches. A few are truly independent. More on one of these in just a minute. Sadly, most people who are members of these historic churches know little or nothing about their origins, and even less about the remarkable legacy of the Christian connection. So, if you recall nothing else from these comments tonight, I hope you will remember just 4 summary takeaways. These constitute the real legacy of the Christian connection. A legacy, I think, that should indeed be called prophetic. Number 1, the Christians were ecumenists before ecumenism was a word, let alone a broad-based movement. More than a century before the ecumenical movement of the early 1900s and beyond, the Christians argued that separation and division are themselves profoundly un-Christian. They insisted that even the familiar names by which we are known separate and divide us. Number 2, the Christians supported women's ministries, at a time when members of almost all other bodies, save perhaps the Free Will Baptists, believed there was no such thing as women's ministries, nor ever should be. As early as 1812, here in New England, female laborers in the gospel, as they were called, worked independently and alongside their male colleagues to preach, teach, and gather new churches, and their successes engendered widespread support. There's a wonderful story. I was trying to find it so I could quote it exactly, but I couldn't. There's a wonderful story that was printed in the pages of the Herald of Gospel Liberty, probably from the mid-18-teens, about one of these female laborers in the gospel whose horse was struck by lightning, thus making it impossible for her to itinerate successfully. But her male colleagues took up a collection and bought her a new horse so that she could continue her work for God. Number 3, the Christians believed in the fundamental equality of all believers. Although their movement gradually became institutionalized, as most movements do or die, with trained leaders and more formal structures, Christians never abandoned this basic and radical principle. Christ's headship levels the field, as we would say today. Under him, we are all one, and no individual is spiritually or functionally superior to another. And number 4, the Christians believed in a faith that was, for its time, remarkably broad and open, not narrow and constrained. God's churches, they felt, and church members should always welcome diverse theological perspectives, so long as these perspectives are held by faithful, morally upright women and men. And so a final story. I'm sure most of you know that George Santayana famously said that those who don't study history are destined to repeat it. That's true, but only partially so. It's also true that those who don't study history, especially their own history, may not repeat it when they should. Instead, they lose sight of good and guiding principles that illuminated not only the past, but could illuminate the present and the future too. My husband Bruce and I live in Wolfboro, New Hampshire, in a house that was the sixth one built in town right around the time of the American Revolution. There are 3 churches along our street, and one of them is that rarity, an independent Christian congregation of perhaps 100, 125 members. This church was founded in the year 1812 in what is now our living room, when an itinerant evangelist named Mark Fernald gathered a few followers together to start a congregation. 200th anniversary, Bruce and I were asked if we'd mind having members gather in our yard to see and celebrate their place of origin. Of course, we said yes. But we also invited everyone to come inside and see the room where it had all begun, and which, by the way, probably looks very much like it did then. I laid out an array of Christian materials for them to look at because I was pretty sure they hadn't seen such things before. That Sunday morning, about 75 people walked up the half-mile hill up Main Street to our home. It was great fun, and in many ways, it was really quite moving to talk with some of these folks. But our conversation quickly made it clear that while these good people knew a little bit about their own founding, they knew virtually nothing about Christian origins, nor anything about the group's prophetic witness in the early 1800s and beyond. Eventually, we all went outside to pray, and the people gathered into several circles. I joined in one of the circles. And here is a bit of a confession. There I did something that I generally try hard not to do, which is to offer a prayer that is intended also as a teaching moment. So I thanked God that the Christians in the early 1800s had been so supportive of women's ministries, so open-minded and open-ended, so supportive of equality among God's people. I expressed gratitude that even today we can learn a great deal from them. As they left, a couple of people came up to me. I'm not sure whether with amazement or suspicion, and said, "I didn't know that." Today, Wolfboro's only active Christian Connection church is, as it has been for several decades, theologically very conservative. Its ministers don't participate in the periodic clergy gatherings that include UCC, Episcopal, Baptist, and even Roman Catholic ministers. Neither its clergy nor its members attend ecumenical Thanksgiving or Easter services. And women never preach there. Let those who have ears to hear listen well to history.
Well, good evening. My assignment tonight is to talk a little bit about Craigville and the camp meeting movement of the 19th century. I would call my little talk, Indoor Religion Meets the Outdoors. Now, it's important to begin to realize in the colonial period, in the early years of the American experience, it included a deep ambivalence about the outdoors. The wilderness was clearly not a friend, but a threat to survival. Nature was to be conquered, to be overcome. To a word I can't read. By the early 19th century, this began to change. Transcendentalists found romance in nature. In the 1840s and 1850s, Thoreau discovered Walden Pond in Cape Cod, and he introduced them to the world. We have the beginnings of urbanization, industrialization, countered by fresh air movements to get people out of the city. For many Protestants, the fear of the wilderness is replaced by fear of the city, its denseness, its immigrants, and those they regarded as infidels, heathen, papists. Once the outdoors was the other, now the other becomes the city. Across the nation, religion is taking on some new forms. As Beth mentioned, the Great Awakening of the 1740s featured traveling evangelists preaching in large urban churches up and down the East Coast. The Great Awakening took place indoors, within churches. The second Great Awakening of the early 19th century was, by contrast, largely an outdoor phenomenon. Same traveling evangelists, but this time they're not going to preach to churches, they're preaching in tents on the frontier, in large fields. And they gave rise and supported some new religious movements: Methodists, Baptists, Disciples of Christ, and others. For religion, the 19th century was a time of unbelievable organizational innovation. Most Protestant denominations split over slavery. Most came back together, but some didn't come back together until the 1950s. With urbanization came greater complexity. With religious disestablishment, that is the end of state churches, a burst of entrepreneurial activity took place in religious communities. We have colleges founded, hospitals, orphanages, the abolition movement, the women's suffrage movement, the temperance movement, other social movements, all burst onto the scene in the middle and the late 19th century. The denominations themselves, as Beth mentioned, began to organize regionally and nationally. And they wrestled with questions of identity. Who are we in a time of increasing ethnic and religious diversity and the beginning global consciousness that came with identification with the missionary movements? Revivals, those outdoor services, were one sort of innovation that took place. There were others. One was the camp meeting, we'll talk a little bit about. Another was the Chautauqua movement, which really was a summer university held in the outdoors. Chautauqua in New York remains active. There were more than 20 of these Chautauqua-type movements by 1874. And by the end of the 19th century, we have the invention of summer youth camping. The camp meeting. Nobody knows for sure how many camp meetings were founded in the 19th century, but there were a lot of them. Researchers have documented over 400 camp meetings founded by Methodists alone. We know of at least 8 here on Cape Cod, with Craigville being the only survivor of those 8. Oak Bluffs, of course, and Martha's Vineyard would be another of the survivors. Now, I want to talk a little bit about those camp meetings. A few years ago, I read a book by an anthropologist named Gwen Kennedy Neville. She wrote a book in 1987 called Kinship and Pilgrimage: Rituals of Reunion in American Protestantism. It's a fascinating exploration of the social worlds of Southern Presbyterians. Centers on Montreat, in the mountains of North Carolina. Montreat is a Presbyterian camp meeting / retreat center that's still active today. It came into being later than Craigville. It was around the turn of the 20th century. So Neville takes an historical and an anthropological point of view in looking at Montreat, but also the larger camp meeting movement. When Neville reminds us that outdoor ministry has its origins in England and Scotland in the 18th century, and it began as a reform movement. Urban residents would leave their cities and return to their home communities in a form of pilgrimage, and they do this as large extended family groups. They developed in doing that a complex series of religious practices apart from formal religious activities. And they interestingly had an adversarial relationship with the European state churches. Those ritual practices took several forms: family reunions, establishment of cemeteries, church homecomings, and importantly, they connected people to their forebears, to traditions and sacred places in their lives. And eventually, religious summer communities began to emerge. Now we'll point out something really, really important about those camp meetings. And to do that, she distinguishes between indoor and outdoor religion. Hang with me for a minute. Indoor religion happens in church buildings. Outdoor religion happens in the open air, in fields and tents and churchyards. Indoor religion is altar-centered. Outdoor religion is congregation-centered. In indoor religion, priests and ministers are in charge. Outdoor religion features the priesthood of all believers. Food is treated differently. Food in church is communion, consecrated by ordained ministers, mostly men. Outdoor religion has food too, but it's ordinary food in shared meals, usually prepared and served by women. Indoor religion tells tales of saints and miracles. Indoor religion tells stories of family, ancestors, and founders. The great value in indoor religion in ecclesiastical tradition and history. Outdoor religion focuses on local history, family history, and histories of place. Indoor religion, correct doctrine, creeds, theology. Outdoor religion, personal faith, experiences, communal life. You get the contrast? Neville argues that urbanization and industrialization combine to break down traditional sources of communal support. We cherish individualism and achievement while we pay lip service to values of family and community. Since the 19th century, she says, this tension between indoor and outdoor religion has become more severe, enhanced by increased technology and social mobility. As inside tradition becomes denser and more entrenched, the need for outdoor religion becomes more imperative. And she writes, the camp meeting ground becomes sacred as an expression of the outdoor church. That symbolic statement of anti-establishment and non-hierarchical tradition that also includes founders of the faith and interlocking kin groups. In the denominational conference center camp meeting, the camp and cottage community, one sees the most elaborate version of sacred space and of enshrined kinship. I remember reading those words and being blown away by them for how much they explained about Craigville for me. Anyway, by the early 20th century, traditional camp meetings are on the decline. The focus of outdoor education shifts to youth, lay education, and clergy education rather than families and congregations. The Lutheran scholar Jacob Sorensen points to competing goals of those early camp meetings: a focus on conversion, a focus on nurture. The core idea is to take people out of the familiar to the unfamiliar and thereby to change their lives. The numbers are astonishing. In the 1920s in the US, there were more than 1 million summer youth camps. 10 years later, there were more than 2 million summer youth camps. Most of them were small, most of them on land given by parishioners, most of them run by a clergy person who liked the idea of being outdoors for the summer. There's a big shift in the 30s and 40s for mainline Protestant camps when the influence of John Dewey becomes very profound. The conversion emphasis gives way to personal enrichment and character development. From the 40s to the 60s, there's another shift from congregational to denominational basis for involvement, as outdoor education becomes part of the portfolio of national and regional denominational organizations. The 70s and 80s were very difficult for outdoor ministry, especially here in the Northeast. In New England, in those 20 years, 2,500 camps were closed, 20%. Those that remained were hit very hard by the recession of 2008, 2009, and later by the COVID pandemic, which has led to dozens of closures of camps across New England. Now, let me say a word about Craigville in that context of the shifting climate in American religion and in the larger camp meeting scene. This village, not then called Craigville, but called Camp Christian, was founded in 1872 as an experimental camp meeting by the Christian churches of New England, Christian Connection. They really didn't know whether there'd be a second camp meeting in 1873. It was a one-shot deal. Beth has described the early Christians as a small restorationist sect known for simplicity of doctrines and for social progressivism. Later, that denomination merged with the Congregational churches and still later became part of the United Church of Christ. The first conversations that took place about merging the Christians and the Congregationalists took place in the Martin Somerville Cottage, now owned by Terry and Doug, with a plaque to show for it. So the Christian congregations from places like Fall River, Lynn, Haverhill, northern New England, and further away in Brooklyn and upstate New York were looking for a shared summer experience. The convention purchased 160 acres overlooking Nantucket Sound, what we now all know as Craigville. As Beth mentioned, these Christians resisted formal structures and creeds. They believed authority lay with individuals and congregations. They were indeed independent-minded folk, but they also had a need and a desire to be together. They thought the camp meeting would give them a way of seeing themselves as part of a wider family. So the Perry brothers, who owned this land, laid out the property. It wasn't really the early leaders of the CCMA, it was the Perry brothers themselves who functioned as the town planners. 258 house lots were eventually sold to families, given free to clergy. In 1888, the CCMA purchased 800 feet of beachfront, 168 of that later being taken by the town for Cobble Beach. And they also accumulated other parcels, including the old cranberry bog, the beach parking lot, and other spots. In 1882, the village was named for theologian pastor Austin Craig. There's no evidence that Craig was ever here, except for a minor role in 1873, the second camp meeting, and a more major role in 1882, the year he died. Big Sunday 1872 initiated the first 10-day camp meeting at Camp Christian. It featured a large tabernacle tent and other tents for sleeping and food preparation. Buildings were added over time, including this open-sided wooden tabernacle in 1887. Several hotels and family plots evolved from tents to simple walls and roof to expansions and in more recent years additions. In 1945, the current beach house was added. You know all that history. By the 1950s, Craigville had become not a camp meeting or a summer school for pastors, but what I would call a summer village with religious overtones. Governance was in the hand of the CCMA, but there was frankly not a lot going on in the 1950s in Craigville. Cape Cod at the same time was growing as a summer and year-round community. The Craigville elders of the time, many of whom still had roots in the Christian connection, approached the Massachusetts Congregational Christian Conference and negotiated a lease for the property. Then a new conference area minister was chosen, who also became the director of the Craigville Conference Center, Pierre Villamere. Marion Villamere, who had been a school teacher, became assistant director for the summer while teaching in the town of Barnstable in the off-season. Later, as Craigville Conference Center grew, she moved to year-round. Marion was remarkable at adding buildings, including the lodge, manor, and the cottages alongside the inn, which she picked up either as gifts or for next to nothing. The business plan was very complex. The beach, the hotel, the summer hotel business, using the inn and the lodge and manor with paying guests, youth around the edges. Marion helped lead the move toward winterization and toward full-year retreat programming. In 1960, there was a feeling that Craigville was losing its religious flavor, and the CCMA board, with Carol Whittemore, a person who lived in Craigville, developed Ministers Row, or Divinity Lane, as Upper Craigville Heights was earlier known. And that led to 20 new clergy and missionary families became part of the community. And the program was remarkably successful. At its peak, it was attracting over 10,000 participants a year for mass conference retreats, choir and bus camps, local church youth, and adult retreats throughout the year. And later, widely used by schools and colleges. Roman Catholic High School, to be perfectly honest, saved the Craigville Retreat Center. It was very, very unquestionable whether it would make it. Now, in a typical year, we host groups ranging from Brazilian Pentecostals to large Korean churches to mushroom pickers. Over time, the mass conference began to lose interest in outdoor education and youth and young adult programming. Frankly, they did not see Craigville as an asset at all. Its membership and financial losses led to other priorities. They had a fear of deficits. They felt that Craigville was a drain on their staff time. In the 1990s, the conference came close to pulling out, and in 2015 they did. After many successful years, 54 or 55 years financially showing a profit, I might add, by the mid-teens, CCMA had at best a reluctant partner who brought little to the relationship. At one point they offered to stay only if we added the conference to our property deeds. An easy decision to reject. And made a decision, they said, based on fit with mission, not finances. We had a tense negotiation over the internal content of the buildings and concluded that relationship and have been managed by a nonprofit management firm since January 2006. Now, Craigville has some very special assets. We have a beach that returns income to the village to support the village program. Residents and friends are extraordinarily generous in supporting the roads, parks, and programs. And the CCMA has covered all the capital expenses for the retreat center since the conference moved in 1960, basically funds raised from within this community. And I think it's fair to say we've made a successful transition from being an old-line Protestant center to becoming a much more pluralistic organization. The Diocese of Fall River, over the years, has moved over 10,000 Roman Catholic youth through confirmation retreats. We have Jewish and pagan and Buddhist users, and mushroom pickers. And I think a successful transition from a religious-affiliated to a religion-friendly private nonprofit. Now, I close with just some questions that keep me awake at night. Answering these questions, I believe, will be an important part of our future. And just four. One, as direct connections to Craigville's Christian Connections founders fade, in other words, as we become even further removed from those who were here in the late 19th century, there's only one resident of the village whose family goes all the way back to the 1870s. It's Debbie Elman. But as those connections, as those direct connections fade, how do we keep that inclusive ecumenical founding vision alive? It doesn't come naturally in this country to lean ecumenically, to lean inclusively. That's a big question. Second, our village ecosystem remains vulnerable to overpopulation and climate change. Will we take the steps that are needed for Craigville's sustainability? We're answering that question right now. Third, Craigville's public life depends on a thriving beach and retreat center, plus the financial gifts and volunteer service of community members. Will this business model work for us in the future? Will the next generation step up, and will others step aside and make room for their leadership? And fourth, over the years, Craigville has become home to persons of varied income levels and backgrounds. As Cape Cod becomes more of a haven for the wealthy and housing costs skyrocket, can Craigville remain accessible to the sons and daughters of those who have called it home? Those are big and difficult questions. Up to now, sometimes in fits and starts, Craigville has shown the capacity to adapt and to build, and my hope is it will continue to do so. And just two final thoughts. Really a return to the big picture. Number one, do we need to consider and to claim an outside tradition? There's something different about religion here in Craigville than a religion in our home communities. I think we know that. I think we haven't articulated it. Outdoor ministry has a subversive side, and it serves as a corrective to overly formalized and bureaucratic expressions of the religious life. And second, I hope will always take seriously that Craigville is a place of positive, life-changing experiences. A study not long ago of Lutheran pastors found that the route to ordination in that church flows directly through youth camping programs. The vast majority of Lutheran pastors started out in places like Craigville. I think that's probably true of most denominations. We need to tell stories of that impact. I told a couple of stories during our most recent capital campaign that captured that for me. One was a donor who made a much larger gift than we expected. And it was Roger Hansen who asked her, why? And she said, well, over the weekend I watched these school kids walking from the lodge to the inn for their meals. And I saw the joy in their faces. And she said, I needed to make a large gift because I want that joy to continue. And a second story, one of my favorites, was walking through the inn during the time we were arranging for the air conditioning and heat. And I met one of the installers of the air conditioning equipment. Got into a conversation. He recalled that day that he had participated in an echo retreat as a high school kid 30 years earlier. And he said these words. He said, I left the church, or it left me, a long time ago. But the cross I made on that retreat is still in my pocket today. An outsider role, a place that changes lives. I think the founders of Craigville would have appreciated that about Craigville today. Thank you.